Hello, I'm Viviane Stappmanns. I'm one of the curators of this exhibition. And as I was walking up here, I was handed the catalogue that was missing before. Here it is. It's available in German and in English. And it contains many of the exhibition's contents. So I'm joined here today by a very illustrious group of people that I would like to introduce. There's Simone Farresin here. You might just need to raise your hand quickly, who's one of the designers of the exhibition. He's one of the two founders of Studio Formafantasma. Andrea is also sitting here, and also Gabriele, who designed the exhibition. He's in the audience today. Formafantasma investigates the ecological, historical, political, and social forces shaping the discipline of design today. And they design products and strategies, but also very successfully, as you will be able to see later on, exhibitions. They're particularly interested in geopolitical forces shaping design and have started and exhibited a number of research projects around natural materials such as wood or wool. Then next to Simone's right is Monika Egerer, who engages professionally with potential garden futures. She's an environmental scientist and a professor of urban productive ecosystems at the University of Munich. In her research, she focuses on ecology and biodiversity in and around cities. We are very interested to hear more from her. It was a topic that we encountered all the time as we were researching this exhibition, especially as she engages with urban gardening and biodiversity and how the two can come together. There's another person here who we're very excited to welcome, a designer whose work is in the show, Gavin, who's sitting to my left, Gavin Munro. And gardens, as we found when we researched, are places that where many interests and sciences converge. And you represent this intersection quite beautifully, because instead of manufacturing furniture, Gavin and his partner in life, Alice Munro, who's also here, grow furniture. They have an orchard in the UK, and what they do there they refer to as biofacture, and Gavin will tell us more about it. And then at the very end of this is my co-curator Marten Kuijpers from the Nieuwe Instituut. He was already introduced before. He's a senior researcher there, and we have worked together on this show over the past year. And also, additional to this, Marten works on an archive of garden and landscape design for the Netherlands, so there's no better person to speak about it or to work with than him. So as we heard before, gardens are very personal spaces. We in Garden Futures noticed that when we started speaking to people, we really realized everyone comes to the garden with very different ideas, and they present personal ideals and also societal ideals. Before I go into asking a number of questions, we heard before what this exhibition is about, but I just wanted to also mention that one of the guiding questions for us was that we feel that the garden has always been a place in which we have negotiated our relationship with nature, both personally and individually. And what we did with the exhibition was trace that relationship and kind of think about and perhaps offer it up for ideas what could happen in the future. Because right now, after the pandemic, where we all found solace in the garden, at the same time we're all plagued by questions around climate change and ecological disaster, and what better place to kind of ask for solutions or ideas for the future than the garden. So given that there are so many personal ideals that everyone comes to this topic with, and you will all go into the exhibition and encounter some of the objects and ideas there and perhaps relate them to your personal ideas. I was going to ask that question first and perhaps ask Simone, because we approached you a year ago, and what first came to mind for you when you heard about gardens, and what kind of ideals were there for you?
Well, of course, there is the personal side, and then there is the professional. Personally, I would say that I have 3 different associations with the garden. My father was a farmer, so for me, gardening it is also about work. And so I associate that with labor. The second is because I grew up in a small village in the northeast of Italy, It's the boringness of petit bourgeois lifestyle in a small village. And the third is, fortunately, I went to study in Florence, and I spent many afternoons studying at the Boboli Gardens, which are beautiful gardens in Italy. And I spent fantastic days there, alone in fantastic gardens.
So I think that answer is perfect, actually, as you will see in the first room of the exhibition. We also try to bring all these things together, the labor of the garden and the hard work, and also this place of finding kind of solace and peace, right? All of that seems
Absolutely.
to be present in your biography. What about you, Monika?
I think that my first, I would associate that with being a child in my father's garden. And that being a place where, even though the garden, when I look back, was now very, very relatively small, it felt like an oasis where you could hide yourself between trees and shrubs, and then go to other sections of the garden where you could pick cherries from trees or pick fresh carrots. And so this connection to nature, to adventure, and also to fresh food is something that I, as a child, have a connection to. And now today in my work, the garden is a laboratory. So this is where we study biodiversity and ecological functions and how that arises from these designs that gardeners are implementing, or these experiments that gardeners are doing.
Right, I might pass that on to you, Gavin, because you also, like Monika, turned it into your profession, right?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, at the beginning of the project, we thought it was like...
You might have to talk a little bit first about what you actually do, and also maybe about your garden.
So the project that we do is, I'm basically a chair farmer. So we shape, a little bit like bonsai, we shape trees into chairs and tables and sculptures and graft them together into one solid piece, and then we harvest them, and it's the idea was a kind of like outdoor factory. And at the beginning, we imagined like a vineyard with rows of chairs and tables and lamps. But there's a lot to learn working with nature, and slowly it's becoming more like a sort of organized woodland that emits furniture. So the real thing has been how subtle a relationship we can have with the natural world, rather than how much control can we have over it. So there's been 20 years of learning.
Right, and going back to your kind of personal ideals, like was there any kind of garden ideal that you brought to it, that you thought of, or that made you engage with this work?
So the sort of first seed was sown when my parents had bonsai trees in the back garden, but with 2 young kids, you don't get much bonsai done, and they'd overgrown, and there was a silhouette of one of them in the winter, and it looked like a throne, and it was that's a beautiful thing. And then I spent most of my childhood in hospital, but one of the hospitals I was in was built into woodland, so it was the ward kind of like went out into the woods, and you could see there was bird feeders, and you could see foxes and badgers, and the kind of combination of how kind and competent the staff were, and the nurses, and the being able to sort of look out into the woodland, I realised, whatever I was going to come next wanted to be based on that. And the kind of final thing was making driftwood furniture on a beach in California, and sticking these bits of wood back together and thinking, oh, hold on a minute, I've seen people shaping trees into things. It would be so much easier just to grow the tree into the object you want. And it's not easy at all.
Right, so 3 very different personal biographical ideas. Perhaps, Marten, you have a story for us about garden ideals and how they kind of shaped in a society over time, right? Because that's what we talked a lot about in our research.
Yeah, that's something that we heavily discussed, and that was, of course, also the main aim of the exhibition, to show how these ideals actually change and how they are reflected in the garden. So in a way, the garden is kind of mirror of society. If you look at the gardens in a particular country or context, you look at the society, right? to give you a personal answer, because this question is huge.
Yes,
and
it
we
is,
only
but
have
I think
35 minutes, but I can give you a few examples from the exhibitions. For instance, in the first room, we tried to kind of show the garden as, this kind of place as, earthly paradise, where our relation to nature, or the relationship between nature and humanity is in like perfect harmony, right? And of course, this is, a myth, because it's not. It is not the case, and it's heavily shaped as well by all kinds of forces and mechanisms, shaped by commercial interests, political interests. That's something that we wanted to. If you go to the exhibition later on, that we wanted to show in the second room, and not only top-down movements, but also grassroots movements that try to fight, these governmental policies, and try to, the seed bomb was already mentioned, but to create gardens in cities on vacant and abandoned plots, Liz Christie, and I can go on and on and on. And also, personal ideas and ideals are reflected in the garden. So if you look at, for instance, the Piet Oudolf was mentioned in the introduction, right? I think he and a lot of other designers he worked together with and German designers, British designers, Dutch designers as well. They introduced that idea of brown is also a color in the garden. So if you look at the garden at the campus here right now, it's still there. And he kind of, introduced an idea for us to accept the beauty of decay in gardens. So there's many examples, political ones, personal ones, and
that you're inspired by?
Yeah, inspired by. And but I think it's also important to reflect upon, like, what does this tell us about, of course, our relationship to nature, and how we define nature, which is different in every single context, of course,
Yeah, and would you say, like also with your research into landscapes and gardens, garden history through this archive that you're building, what kind of ideal are we striving for as a society today as opposed to perhaps 50 years ago? Is there any kind of general statement to make about that? I know how hard it is. We did the research together, but I think there are some general pointers.
Yeah, if there is one, of course it's hard to answer, but if there is one recurring element in lots of gardens, it's that in a way the concept of the garden, especially the Western concept of a garden, is a bit problematic, no? And because it's always based on this idea of an enclosure. And a garden is this second or third nature, this kind of domesticated version of the wild. And it's actually fencing off that outside world. And well, to answer your questions, I'm sorry, but I think what we've been seeing in the last 2 decades is that there are ideas coming up within designing communities, but also gardening communities, that in which this kind of hard and strict border between this separation between nature and culture, between in and out, between the garden and like the wilderness, is going to become a bit more porous. And we also see ideas in which the garden is actually, losing its fences, losing its boundaries, and spreading across the urban fabric. Yeah.
Urban fabric's a good keyword. I might turn to Monika for a moment. You've engaged a lot with urban gardening and urban farming, and you're conducting research now. But can you tell us about it's something that we're all familiar with. We all talk about it a lot. We had a small conversation a few days ago in which you said it's quite hard to kind of put figures on what the trends there actually are. But can you give us an impression of what's been happening over the past few decades around urban farming? It feels like this big trend, but what has actually happened?
So I think also just to think about this, the trend in gardening, it's also important to just define what is garden. So I think we are all talking about gardens, but what do we mean? And this is a very diverse form of horticultural system. And so, yeah, I'm a little bit biased. I think my favorite garden is community gardens that are designed around food and flower production, that are collectively managed by folks in cities, and are thus very diverse because you have like micro-scale management going on in each of these individual allotment plots. And so we have, market gardens that are very maybe production-oriented. We have home gardens that we've also talked about that do embody like the private person's relationship with nature. We have vertical gardens. We have all these different kinds of gardens. And so the trends are, what trends I can speak to then relate to what type of garden we're talking about. And so community gardening and urban farming and agriculture is certainly booming, but the space for it is also shrinking as many cities are densifying. And so it's, I actually, in trying to prepare for this, I asked one of our colleagues from Berlin that works for one of the urban gardening programs, what is the data on like the increase or the loss of urban gardens, community gardens?
Germany, particularly to
for Germany, and there's not really much data at all. So on the other side, we have like studies that do a lot of modeling, and there's a recent study that came out that is getting a lot of press, that about 80% of the vegetable consumption in Germany, or in Berlin, not in Germany, could be achieved through utilizing rooftop space or utilizing Brachen or other spaces in the city. So there is really good modeling data or theoretical data saying that urban farming could achieve a large percentage of the city's food security when it comes to fresh fruits and vegetables. And we already know that there's millions of urban farmers around the world. There's very little data because it's hard to track individual practices, and also urban farms and gardens are constantly lost due to urban densification.
Is this sorry to interrupt, but is this something that you mean the Western world, or would this happen everywhere? Is this a global statement you can make?
I would say yine. I would say it depends on the city. I think, so much of the data that we have is often from Western cities, right. Because these may be the places where we document it best. So in our research, we currently work in 30 community gardens in Berlin and Munich, and looking at how garden design impacts biodiversity, specifically of insects, and we're very interested in pollinators. And this is where we often lose gardens because they are then converted into another use.
Yeah, and but one thing you mentioned before that I just want to quickly key into is how garden design impacts biodiversity. How could we imagine that? Like, how do you research what do you mean by garden design?
Yeah, I'm using the term design because now I'm amongst designers here at the museum.
Which is great.
If I was with my ecological or my ecology colleagues, I'd probably use the word like land use or land management. So we look at, in our research plots, we do surveys of plants. We look at the ground cover management. So is there rocks? Is there mulch? Is there bare ground? So thinking about these brown aspects, what flowers are there present? What colors are the flowers? And then we do observations for insects, and specifically for bees. So, for example, in our research in Berlin and Munich, we found about 700 plant species in our observations in 1 year in these gardens. And in Berlin alone, we have found over 100 wild bee species. 25% of those are on the red list. So I think this is something I want to talk about later, but I think this indicates that gardens, and specifically also how they're managed, because we know that from our research that higher plant diversity increases the wild bee diversity, that these are places of conservation. And gardeners play a key role in conservation action if they are taking certain design or management strategies in their gardens.
Right, okay, thank you for that. I want to turn to another topic briefly, actually about Garden Futures as an exhibition, and go back to Simone for a moment. We have been giving, Martin and I, over the past couple of days, quite a few interviews. You weren't here yet at that time. But one question I was asked all the time is, how do you design an exhibition about gardens and about all these themes we've now talked about? That was a question that you were confronted with at the time, and you had some very particular ideas. How did you respond?
Well, when we had to think about the exhibition design, there is one thing we were sure we did not want to do, and it's repeating twice the content. So we all the time think that if an exhibition is about the garden, you shouldn't design the exhibition as a garden. In a way, somebody says once, you never say love in a poem about love. So it goes in the same direction. On the other side, something we try to communicate with the show, which is very subtle maybe, is that we use a lot of textile and indoor materials, but it's somehow a reference of how the garden is often conceived as a space of control. So for instance, if you think about the traditional Italian gardens, for instance, it is all about creating sort of fences and doors, indoor spaces, as it was mentioned before. And in this sense, also our design is underlining that. It is not about the recreation of the outdoor, but it suggests actually indoorness, if that's a word.
Yeah, so you're talking about this domestication of the garden, which has often happened, and then the content talks about what Martin started to talk about, which is this idea that perhaps the fence or the domestication is coming to a moment where it might be reconsidered. Monika's already talking about a lot of urban gardening, and we all think that it's happening a lot more, and I think also we found some really interesting projects where it is happening a lot more. But Martin, can you talk a little bit about the kind of underlying theoretical ideas that we found, where people are talking about this idea that perhaps domestication isn't something that shouldn't happen anymore?
In what sense?
Well, there is a few there's a few projects in the exhibition that really look at kind of how we might change perspective and sort of not necessarily talk about the garden anymore as a place that we fence and domesticate, but something where we let other beings into the garden or work with them together.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, there was like millions of examples on our long list for the exhibition in which designers and garden designers and gardeners actually introduce ideas that, in a way, question the human centricity in design, and which is what Simone just mentioned, so present in the garden as well. It's about, controlling, taming nature. And so we've seen, and there are a couple of beautiful examples in the exhibition of garden designs in which other than or more than human perspective is introduced. But how do you do that, right? So to give you an example, there is the pollinator pathmaker. I think you're kind of pointing in that direction, yeah. Pollinator pathmaker, a project by Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg. And lots of designers are actually doing that, because how to kind of get rid of your own human intervention in the garden, right? So she's introducing tech, and tech in this case it's an algorithmic tool to generate planting schemes, planting plants for gardens, for pollinator-friendly gardens. And by doing that, so basically you fill out a form on a website as someone that wants to have a pollinator-friendly garden, and then this tool, this algorithmic tool, generates a planting scheme that is, that creates the right conditions for these bees and insects that you want to have to pollinate a garden. And But in the end, of course, the algorithmic tool is also designed by a human being, so it's still, it's super problematic.
Yeah.
It's actually, we shouldn't do anything, but and that actually refers back to the idea of a fence place. I was thinking about that. We had a wonderful discussion yesterday in our tour, the press tour, and someone was asking me, like, because in the last room we're introducing this idea of the world as a garden, like, based and inspired on Gilles Clement's idea of the planetary garden, like to see the planet as a garden that we need to care for, right? It introduces a kind of collective responsibility. But she was asking me, like, oh, but it's such a bad idea, to see the whole world as a garden, because it means that you kind of think that we should actually, as human beings, we should be controlling it or caring for it, but the nature can very much care for itself, It doesn't need us. I think we need to kind of save ourselves, and giving all these kind of multiple crises that we are confronted with at the moment. But after that discussion, I was thinking about, again, about this, because we also asked in many conversations that we had the question, like, who actually needs protection from whom, right? So in the beginning it was, humanity need to have protection from the wild. And so, we create a place which is called a garden, which is fenced off that outside world. And now it's perhaps the other way around. And that reminds me of the beautiful project of these Ethiopian ecologists in room 4, the church forest gardens, in which he actually introduced low walls to protect and preserve the biodiversity in these church gardens. So, yeah, to explain it a little bit, but Ethiopia used to be covered by forests, of course, but it is all gone due to deforestation, the emergence of industrial farming. So what is left still are gardens around churches, and that are more or less, a garden of Edens that they still tend and nurture in order to, because it belongs to the church, etc. So these small gardens around these churches are kind of oases of biodiversity that the surrounding context is fully dependent on. But what this guy is, actually introducing to protect them is the wall again. So if thinking about this idea of doing nothing, right, nature can take care of itself, it's perhaps also a good idea to think again about, but perhaps this is super problematic what I'm saying right now, to think about these walls again, like to introduce a separation between nature and culture again, so that nature can thrive again. But just an idea,
Yeah, well, I suppose in the research, this idea of the fence continues to pop up, like, is the garden a space where we shelter ourselves, or where humans used to shelter themselves from the wilderness beyond, or now it's becoming a place where we protect that same wilderness in the garden. But also what we've noticed is that gardens are becoming much more porous. It's no longer like the city is the space for the humans and the garden is somewhere in between or beyond, but gardens kind of infiltrate our living spaces, and perhaps these are spaces in which we can garden to bring in biodiversity or even animal life into cities. Would you say that? It's really interesting that you, Monika, have said actually urban gardening, or the space for urban gardens or possibilities in cities, is decreasing. At the same time, we, as the people looking at it, seem to think that there is all this increase and all this interest in these practices in bringing nature into cities. Many landscape architects you talk to are very interested in that idea, to sort of create these human and nature alike living spaces within our cities. But then it seems like that sort of collaboration with nature that we're all hoping for is a little bit problematic or not possible, right?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, because maybe it's just like the more or less traditional forms of gardening. So where it's like in an enclosed space, the land is safe for this But instead we see really, really creative ways in which urban gardening is happening, whether what was mentioned with guerrilla gardening or seed bombs or balconies. Like, you know, in some cities you walk down the street and balconies are full of their own form of mini garden systems. So, and yeah, working with buildings and thinking about how to create facades and having these walls as gardens. So I mean, maybe it's just more traditional, like a on-the-ground form of a garden. If land is scarce in a city, those gardens and those forms of gardening may be declining if there's, land pressure. But there's a lot of possibility, which we've also then talked about too. So I would say maybe people are getting more creative in ways that they seek to do urban gardening. Whether it is with the building or working with gray infrastructure, we would call it, or working in small spaces. So I really like what's here is like thinking about like creativity and experimentation and thinking about how to do that in the city. So I don't want to say decreasing or increasing. Maybe it's just a different way in which we quantify or assess or characterize urban gardening. And it's becoming just more diverse or vielfältig in how it's happening.
Right. Are there concrete examples that you can point to when you say you see some real creativity, how this is happening?
I mean, I really like when I'm just walking down the street, whether it's in Munich or in Berlin where we work, and you see these little like pocket, like these Padenschaft, or like these tree pits that have been now like taken over by a neighbor and just like created their own little garden. And they're cared for by the neighbors, and even though this is basically, or maybe public space, these are really nice small pocket gardens in the landscape that, yes, maybe from an ecologist perspective or a conservation perspective, we still need these big areas in the city that can support populations of insects or birds or whatever animal we're talking about. But these small little patches can contribute to be little stepping stones in the landscape. So I think I really like how people are just starting to guerrilla garden along the street and create these little gardens around the tree pit. So that's one example that I have. Yeah.
Right, that's a very kind of local example. Gavin, I'm interested to hear, like you are engaging with sort of gardening with like growing your own products all the time. What kind of problems does that bring as well? This kind of
I don't think we've got time for all the problems we have, but
right.
I think the main thing is that is the time it takes for a learning curve to working with trees, especially, who kind of, they live in terms of decades. So, initially when we started, we thought it would take like 2 or 3 years to you do something, and then 2 or 3 years later you know whether it worked or not. But it's more like a decade or maybe more, because trees change, they don't stay still, there's more going on than we kind of realise. So the real trick is rather than kind of, I don't know what the real trick is yet, but it seems like we force ourselves onto that's what gardening is to some degree, is kind of making the decisions of what lives and doesn't. But actually listening to what the trees really want, that's a whole new kind of way of thinking, or for me at any rate, is, when we force the trees too much, they resist in ways that doesn't really help. And everything that we've done that's working is more kind of listening to what's already going on without putting yourself in the picture. It's like, what does the tree really want? And somebody was talking about soil earlier, like that's, to some degree, it doesn't matter about the people and the trees, you've got to get the soil right before you even kind of get there. So yeah, it's a lot of rethinking what we thought we knew and trying to pay attention to what's really going on with the plants, what what they actually want. I don't know how it's hard to describe.
No,
it.
it's actually perfect because it's really interesting. One thing we found in our research, we're in a design museum here, and we've ventured out into gardens as a place of design. But at the same time, I think coming from this background of design, both Marten and I kind of kept thinking about gardening also as a metaphor, perhaps, for designing, and as something that can inspire all other kinds of design. So what you're saying now, and you are working as a designer in a kind of gardening way, right? And all the things you mentioned is it takes time, it needs local intervention. There's constant learning and failing and very small steps in moving forward. It's something that we've really found is interesting because that's also entering the design space a lot, right? So designing is becoming much more like gardening.
Yeah, it seems like with designing that collaborating really seems to help, and actually rather than by working with the trees, to some degree, they show what they would like to do. And if we go down that road, so rather than kind of forcing a traditional chair shape onto them, if we kind of go with what the trees already want to do, and it's hard to kind of really know that, but the more that we do, the better it seems to work. So it's kind of like, how does the tree want to grow, and can we work with that and still get the object that we want as well? It's a sort of, so we're kind of collaborating with the tree is a lot.
Designing with nature, as we say here.
Yeah.
I might actually move on to Simone, because you're the designer here, but you're also engaging a lot with kind of different new ways of doing design and researching design. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on this. Like, can designing be more like this kind of gardening, where it is about the local conditions? I mean, I was asking Monika before, is these kinds of things that you see, are they something global? And your answer was, I'm not really sure, but our answer to it is, just after doing all this research, it's really hard to make global statements about anything to do with gardens or gardening. And with design, we sometimes like to make global statements,
Indeed.
But I think we are starting
That's a problem, huh? I think we should
That
start.
is a global statement too. So, so what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think we should try to make less global statement. I think that's a very modernist idea, let's make global statement, let's make it great and expand it. But we learned that's not really working in a way. No, there is something really interesting, I think was pointed out before, that it's incredibly interesting what an exhibition like this and many other of these activities can do is in, pointing out to some movements that are happening in our urban environment. But I think it is also important to realize that that's not enough, that these things exist bottom up. I think they need to be also recognized and supported to support these sort of, I would call them like fragile narratives, because if we notice that there is an interest from everybody, from the citizen, in making sure that the city could become an environment for growth, healthy growth, and I mean possibly even an economic growth, but also, actually, I don't want to talk about economic growth, but more like possibility to grow like vegetables and food to sustain the city. It is not enough that it's the citizen doing that. It is important that entrepreneurs do that. It's important that politically this is recognized. Otherwise, they will always remain fragile narratives. And I think an exhibition like this can help, and designers can help in showing where the path is, also to maybe decision makers.
I am wondering though, because you're about to, or you're sort of, I think, in the finishing processes of doing a really large project on wool, and you've done one on wood before. So you are also looking at designing with nature in a really different way. And these kinds of realizations that we've found about the garden, how the garden's always been a teacher, and it's a place where you sort of learn and fail and then try again, like Gavin is saying. And it's quite sort of small steps in moving forwards with a lot of failure. Do you feel like when you do these research projects, that's something that sort of resonates, that we might start to think about things a little bit this way? I
mean, of course, I think the most fulfilling part of doing research work is that it also becomes a learning process, and this experience of constantly revisiting what your starting point is. I think it is a sort of part of our, I would say, practice. I think something that I would like to underline there is that I'm not sure there is such a thing as not designing with it. Sorry, I don't think it's possible to do not design with nature. What I mean to say is that whatever we do, even when we produce an industrial product, in any case, the sourcing comes from the environment. So I think the realization that we need to, I think, get to really understand is that, first of all, we are part of nature as humans, and second of all, that it's impossible not to design with nature, because whatever we do is somehow an extraction of value, resources, energy from the natural environment. So in a way, I would say that whatever we do in the planet Earth is a form of gardening in the sense of shaping whatever is around us.
It's just a way of how doing it.
Exactly.
Right?
I think that's the point. We have to rethink how we do things.
Yeah, and perhaps a little bit more like you, right? Learning and failing and growing and moving slowly. Right.
Get up again.
Well, I think these are great closing words, and I think everyone's probably keen to wander over and see the exhibition. It's just about to get dark. And Gavin's work is hanging there, and Simone's work is all over the place, and Monika's thoughts are in it, and so are Marten's.
Your work is all over the place.
And that's true. We hope you have a wonderful evening in the exhibition, and would love to hear what you think. So come and speak to us.